welcoming to the stage Michael Brough. You may be familiar with Michael Brough, as he has been a roguelike developer for a long time now, best known for roguelikes on small grids that people call Roguelikes, and advocates of actually playing the game Rogue. So we are going to welcome Michael Brough to talk about some of the history of Rogue itself and the history of roguelikes within fiction. So if we are ready, then welcome to the stage, Michael Brough. Hello.
Hello. Can I be bigger and the image be smaller?
Oh, let's see.
Okay. And by the blood of that one whom it is death to look upon, so sonorously invoked the mouser, as with eyes closed and arms outstretched, he cast the rune given him by Shieldwell of the Idler Space, which would destroy all sorcerers of less than first rank of an undetermined distance around the casting point, surely for a few miles, one might hope, so smiting Hasjal's warlocks to dust. So I'm reading to you from Lords of Carmel by Fritz Lieber, from his stories of Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. And in this story, the two heroes, Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, have traveled their separate ways, and coincidentally, both come into service of each of one of two brothers, the princes of Carmel. And the older brother, Hasjal, employs 24 wizards of the Second Order, and they're casting evil spells to try and kill his brother. Gwei has 12 wizards of the First Order defending him. And the brothers are very evenly matched. This one has 24 wizards, but they're half as good, more or less, as this one. So these guys have been in conflict for a long time, and they've each hired a hero, and the heroes are also fairly evenly matched because they're best friends, and they don't know that. So it's a fun little story. And what's happening in this scene? The Mouser is casting a spell from a scroll that was given him by Shieldwell, who's a kind of quest giver character who he meets with sometimes. And the scroll allegedly destroys all sorcerers of less than first rank, which is quite convenient on this quest when he's working for the guy who has supposedly first rank sorcerers, whose opponent has only second rank sorcerers. So he's hoping that by casting the spell, he will destroy all his opponent's wizards and keep all his employer's wizards. Whether his great spell worked or not, and in his inmost heart he strongly mistrusted that it would, the Mouser was very pleased with the performance he was giving. He doubted Shieldwell himself could have done better. What magnificent deep chest tones! Even Fafhrd had never heard him declaim so. He wished he could open his eyes for just a moment to note the effect his performance was having on Gwei's magicians. They'd be staring open-mouthed for all their supercilious boasting, he was sure. But on this point, Shieldwell's instructions had been adamant. Eyes tightly shut while the last sentences of the rune were being recited and the great forbidden words spoken, even the tiniest blink would nullify the great spell. Evidently, magicians were supposed to be without vanity or curiosity. What a bore. Of a sudden, in the dark of his head, he felt contact with another and a larger darkness, a malefic and puissant darkness of which light itself is only the absence. He shivered, his hair stirred, cold sweat prickled his face. He almost stuttered midway through the word, flourish of black, but concentrating his will, he finished without flaw. When the last echoing notes of his voice had ceased to rebound between the domed ceiling and floor, the Mouser slipped open one eye and glanced surreptitiously about him. One glance, and the other eye flew up into fullness. He was too surprised to speak. And whom he would have spoken to, had he not been too surprised, was also a question. The long table at the foot of which he stood was empty of occupants, where but moments before had sat 11 of the very greatest magicians of Carmel, sorcerers of the first rank, each had sworn on his black grummery, was only space. So this scene is really interesting to me because it's the Grey Mouser is a rogue character. He and Fafhrd, they travel, they steal things, they live by their wits, they are rogues. And this is an example in some of the fiction that was inspiring Dungeons and Dragons, which inspired Rogue and Roguelikes, of a rogue casting a magic spell from a magical scroll. A thing that happens all the time in the game Rogue. And yeah, when I read this, having already played Rogue and NetHack and so forth, I went click. I was like, oh, this is where that came from. This is where that game mechanic originated. This is why a rogue can cast spells. And reading more of the series, you find out that actually the Mouser, before becoming a traveling thief, he trained as a magician. He was an apprentice magician, but that went poorly. And well, read the stories if you want to know what happened. But yeah, so that this particular rogue character has a background as a magician, an apprentice magician, affects what he was then doing later in his career, and then in making the game Dungeons and Dragons, more or less they were drawing from this body of fantasy fiction, and they wanted the kinds of scenes and adventures that happen in it to be things that could happen in the game. And one example of a scene that happened is a rogue casting a magic spell. So this, in my opinion, is how it came to pass that the Dungeons and Dragons rogue character has the use magic device ability, whereas say the fighter or barbarian character doesn't. Because in the stories that they were referencing, a rogue will sometimes figure out how to use a magical wand, or in this case, be able to use a spell that's written on a scroll. And then, so Dungeons and Dragons had that mechanic for the rogue class, and then following that, we get the game Rogue, in which a thief travels through a dungeon, picks up lots of magic devices, figures out how to use them, and so on and so forth. And like, so the scene and these events and these stories have kind of shaped our genre. Yeah, so Dungeons and Dragons. So this story was first published in, I haven't written it down here, mid-60s, I think, maybe earlier. Like, it's hard to tell with some of these stories, because like the publication date you'll see might be when there was a book that it was published in, but a lot of them were originally published in magazines. So I'm not sure when the story was first published, but like at least a decade or so before Dungeons and Dragons happened in 1974. So Dungeons and Dragons, it has two main branches of ancestry. It was based on a fantasy war, like a miniature war game called Chainmail, and that has these little pieces moving around in a grid, throwing fireballs and stabbing each other with swords. Chainmail was obviously inspired by previous miniature war games, which were generally less of a fantasy bent, more like enacting like actual historical wars. The ideas for those games kind of come from wargaming as a way of planning strategies for actual war. People would get little pieces and try and imagine if we put our cavalry here and approach this way, and like move the pieces around and play out the game to plan the battle. And then obviously this was inspired by the actual practice of actually fighting and killing people. So our games have roots in actual horrific violence, but also like the other culture that has emerged throughout history. And the other main root for Dungeons and Dragons is the fantasy fiction of early to mid 20th century, which was mainly what the I'll share. Here we go. I hope you can see this now. Appendix N. This is from the AD&D Dungeon Master's Guide. So it's written by Gary Gygax. Inspiration for all the fantasy work I have done stems directly from the love my father showed me when I was a lad. For he spent many hours telling me stories he made up as he went along, tales of cloaked old men who could grant wishes, of magic rings and enchanted swords, of wicked sorcerers and dauntless swordsmen. Then to countless hundreds of comic books went down. The long-gone EC ones certainly had their effect. Science fiction, fantasy, and horror movies were a big influence. All of us tend to get ample helpings of fantasy when we were very young, from fairy tales, such as those written by the Brothers Grimm and Ernest Long, reading books of mythology, bestiaries, compilations of myths of various lands and people. On such a base, I built my interest in fantasy, being an avid reader of all science fiction and fantasy literature since 1950. The following authors were of particular inspiration to me. In some cases, I cite specific works, and some, he recommends a series of authors here. And midway down the list, you'll see Fritz Lieber, Pfaffert, and the Grey Mouser, which I was just reading from. This list is pretty good. I'd honestly recommend. I haven't read everything on this list, but what I have, Lee Brackett, Edgar S. Burroughs, Lynn Carter, Elsbreg, De Camp, Philip J. Farmer, Lord Dunsany, Robert E. Howard, Fritz Lieber, Howard Phillips Lovecraft, Michael Moorcock, Tolkien, obviously, Jack Vance, Roger Zelazny. There's amazing writing here. This a lot. I'll just leave that up for now. A lot of So some of these listed are novels, but a lot of them are short stories. And in kind of the first half of the 20th century, there was actually quite a accessible market for short stories, because there were magazines called the pulps where they published individual short stories collected like a few in a magazine, and they would pay for them, and anybody could post in a story, and maybe it would be accepted, and maybe you pay money for it. So like it's actually kind of rare that there's really a way to make money doing art that's this accessible. And like we've seen that in like the Flash games market and then the mobile games market. Like there were briefly accessible spaces where a huge amount of creativity flourished, and then it kind of dies as it gets less accessible. And that's what happened here. Like a huge amount of creativity flourished in terms of writing short stories, and then these magazines died out, and the market became dominated by novels. And like if you look in the latter half of last century, pretty much any fantasy thing you find is a trilogy that's trying to be the next Lord of the Rings. And like there's still stuff going on, but it's not the same like absolute fermenting creativity. And so novels and like epic trilogies have epic heroes, but short stories are much more suited to rogues. So that's why this particular era I found quite interesting in reference to roguelikes, because people were writing brief adventures that happen across a dozen pages, where often quite roguish characters did have an arc of discovery and adventure and success and failure, and it's just very roguelike. And also obviously Dungeons and Dragons is inspired both by these short stories and by the novels, but I just think in the format of a tabletop role-playing game where you're gathering a group of people together, say once a week or whatever, then each session needs to have a satisfying narrative arc within itself, and so the mode of storytelling in the short stories was more of an inspiration for how a play session is structured to make that work. If you have an epic story that goes across many sessions, you still have to have each session have a self-contained arc in which it feels satisfying to do that, or people aren't going to keep coming back every week for the session to work. So I find this era of fiction really kind of a primary source for the rogue characters, and so it's really interesting to look at in developing roguelikes. Not that roguelikes with how expansive the genre has become always feature characters who fit this model, but still it's just important to me to look at the roots, right? How the ideas have developed over time. If there's something that you like, look at the things that inspired it, and you'll probably like them as well, or at least find something of interest to you there, and learn something and deepen your appreciation for the work that you were interested in the first place. Because if someone's taken a source and been inspired by it and expanded something of their own, you don't know what they personally added unless you know the source material as well, right? Like if you look at the source material and you look at what's been derived from it, you can tell, oh, this thing that I thought I was really impressed with this person's work, but actually it's completely derivative of the source material. Then you know. Or if, yes, this person was drawing from the source, but they added so much of their own and they really brought something new, then you know. And like beyond that abstract level, like the specifics and the mechanics of how an idea develops over time, how an idea adapts to fit into different contexts. But like this is why I always advocate for people who are interested in roguelikes to go back and play Rogue, because we're giving the game a place of honor by naming the genre after it, but it's weird to say this is my inspiration. This is what I'm honoring if you don't actually know the details. That's what I think. I don't want to get into any arguments here, but So I strongly recommend reading some of this early 20th century fantasy fiction that Dungeons and Dragons was based on. I recommend having some familiarity with Dungeons and Dragons and the other top tabletop role-playing games of the 70s and 80s, because that's what Rogue and many early video games came out of. And there's so much for creative heritage that we owe to the work in those times that we're building upon. And I know sometimes people, when they read these older stories, because they're written in a different time, in a different cultural context, sometimes people find some aspects of the different culture of the time uncomfortable. Like there's a culture clash because it was written in a time when the cultural norms were different, and I find that sad when that stops someone being able to engage with a work but like if that's you, if that's the case, if that discomfort is so much that you simply can't, then like that's the position that you're in. But to me, again, looking at the development of ideas across time, because if you read something like The Nightland from 1912, I think it's a visionary work. It's the way it evokes a fantastical landscape is like just incredible. But it has one female character, and she is depicted as completely helpless to do anything by herself, and it's just like absolutely embarrassing to read those scenes. And then if you have that contrast, if you read something from the 40s or the 60s, and the female characters are sometimes like throwing daggers and able to hold themselves in a fight, like they're, even though there's still cultural attitudes that are uncomfortable. Like if you trace them out across time and then towards the present, you really, it's a way of really seeing that the change that has happened, and that gives a lot of hope. If you just look at the problems that there are in society at a particular point in time, even if you look at today, it's easy to despair. But if you have this picture of the development that's happened over time, then you can really, it gives hope. It's nice. So the next author I want to talk about is Jack Vance. I have Tales of the Dying Earth here. When people talk about Jack Vance in reference to inspiration of games, what they usually talk about is Vancian magic, maybe Vancian magic because he's American. So some of these names, like especially the characters in the book, like if you've learned the names by reading, you don't necessarily know the original intended pronunciation. So if I get some of that wrong, then like just make up your own pronunciation and we'll all be fine. So Vancian magic is, what is it? It describes how magic spells work in basically these 4 books that I'm holding in one tome here. I'll read a section that more or less explains it. In ages gone, the sage had said, his eyes fixed on the low star, 1,000 spells were known to sorcery, and the wizards affected their wills. Today, as Earth dies, 100 spells remain to man's knowledge, and these have come to us through the ancient books. But there is one, called Pendulum, who knows all the spells, all the incantations, cantrips, runes, and thaumaturgies that have ever wrenched and molded space. He had fallen silent, lost in his thoughts. Where is this Pendulum? Turjan had asked presently. He dwells in the land of Imbellion, the sage had replied. But where this land lies, no one knows. How does one find Pendulum then? The sage had smiled faintly. If it were ever necessary, a spell exists to take one there. Both had been silent a moment, and the sage had spoken, staring out over the forest. One may ask anything of Pendulum, and Pendulum will answer, provided that the seeker performs the service Pendulum requires. And Pendulum drives a hard bargain. Then the sage had shown Turjan the spell in question, which he had discovered in an ancient portfolio and kept secret from all the world. Turjan, remembering this conversation, descended to his study, a long, low hall with stone walls and a stone floor, deadened by a thick russet rug. So sorry, in the context of the short story, that time skip would have been clearer. So Turjan has had a problem. He doesn't know, nothing in his books, nothing can fix it. So then he was remembering what Pendulum was telling about the origin of spells and handle him. So now we're back to the present of the story, and here we go. So the tomes which held Turgeon's sorcery lay on the long table of black steel or thrust helter-skelter into shelves. These were volumes compiled by many wizards of the past, untidy folios collected by the sage, leather-bound librams setting forth the syllables of 100 powerful spells, so cogent that Turgeon's brain could know but 4 at a time. Turgeon found a musty portfolio, turned the heavy pages to the spell the sage had shown him, the call to the violent cloud. He stared down at the characters, and they burned with an urgent power, pressing off the page as if frantic to leave the dark solitude of the book. Turgeon closed the book, forcing the spell back into oblivion. He robed himself with a short blue cape, tucked a blade into his belt, fitted the amulet holding Lacadel's rune to his wrist. Then he sat down and from a journal chose the spells he would take with him. What dangers he might meet he could not know, so he selected 3 spells of general application: the excellent prismatic spray, Fandol's mantle of stealth, and the spell of the slow hour. He climbed the parapets of his castle and stood under the far stars, breathing the air of ancient earth. How many times had this air been breathed before him? What cries of pain had this air experienced? What sighs, laughs, war shouts, cries of exultation, gasps? The night was wearing on. A blue light wavered in the forest. Turgeon watched a moment, then at last squared himself and uttered the call to the violent cloud. All was quiet. Then came a whisper of movement swelling to the roar of great winds. A wisp of white appeared and waxed the pillar of boiling black smoke. A voice deep and harsh issued from the turbulence. At your disturbing power is this instrument come. Whence will you go? 4 directions. Then 1, said Turgeon. Alive must I be brought to Vancian. The cloud whirled down. Far up and away he was snatched, flung head over heels into incalculable distance. 4 directions was he thrust, then 1, and at last a great blow hurled him from the cloud, brought him into Vancian. Turgeon gained his feet and tottered a moment half dazed. His senses steadied. He looked about him. So, like, this more or less gives the picture of how magic works in this so-called Vancian magic system. So spells are discrete named effects. Like in video games, we kind of take this axiom for granted, but if you think about all the range of different ways magic has been depicted in fiction, it's a little bit weird. Like magicians could just call forth spirits of nature and command them what to do with sentences. There's depictions of magic as a form of science that has all the checks and balances that naturally exist within a form of engineering. Magic can just be sheer mystery that is never explained. So there's many ways that magic could operate, and this way of magic operating is with discrete effects that come in a particular chunk. In times past, magicians had the ability to create these spells. It says all 100 spells were crafted by Fandol, many spells were crafted by other wizards. And that lore is largely lost because these stories are set in the time of the dying Earth, when many civilizations have risen and fallen. 3-minute warning. Oh, really? If you say so. And spells must be memorized to cast them, and in the act of casting them, they burnt out of your brain. So this is super flavorful, and it's a storytelling mechanic. It enables telling stories of a form where a character collects a series of, like, this is a common story format that happens in it's in some fairy tales, it's in a lot of the pulp stories, where a character has a set of items and then they go off in their adventure, face a few different challenges, and then each challenge is solved with one of these items. And yeah, this story mechanic enables telling stories where this kind of format happens, but it's about a wizard, because it's quite hard to tell stories about wizards. For example, in Lord of the Rings, Gandalf is never around at a critical moment. You have to do something to get the omnipotent one out of the way to have some conflict in the story. So this is a story mechanic which became a game mechanic, but it's in reference to roguelikes, it's perhaps not the most interesting thing to talk about. And it's only a small part of what happens in these books. Yeah. Oops. Sorry, I had understood that this. I had gotten my timetable confused, and I'm sorry. I wanted to talk about a bunch more stuff which I can't fit in so much. Okay, I will. So the middle section of this book is the tales of Kugel, who is a rogue, and that is much more interesting from the perspective of roguelikes. And we're introduced to a character, Vornod, who's a wizard. He has a bunch of magic items. Then through his trickery, Kugel comes into possession of these magic items, and then he says, "Behold, I'm a powerful wizard. Behold, this tube that projects blue concentrate." And when I first read this, I thought Kugel, like Vornod was a real wizard, Kugel is just pretending to be a wizard. But then I thought about it more, like they both did exactly the same things, but their being a wizard is defined by having this collection of magic items. And yeah, so that's really the arc of roguelikes. That the character starts as a rogue, collects these magic items, and then at the end is that the decisions that you're making in the game are more the decisions of a wizard than the decisions of a rogue. Right, so that's my quick summing up. Thank you.
Yes.